This is the third and final part of the critical thinking workshop. This third part covers intellectual virtues. In part 1, we covered the elements of thought. In part 2, we covered the intellectual standards that should be applied to each element of thought. Here in this final episode, we will cover intellectual virtues that are exhibited when we apply intellectual standards to our elements of thought. What is virtue? What are moral virtues? What are intellectual virtues? A virtue is a beneficial quality, feature, or trait leading to excellence, advantage, or goodness. We can trace the definition of virtues back to Aristotle. Types of virtues he defined are intellectual virtues, the virtues of the rational part of the soul, and moral virtues derived from attitudes in us. According to Aristotle, intellectual virtues are virtues of the mind, such as the ability to understand, reason, and make sound judgment. Intellectual virtues may be taught, like logic and mathematics, by teachers. Moral virtues are not innate, rather they are acquired through repetition and practice, like learning a music instrument. It is through the practice and the doing that one becomes a type of person. Over a period of time, virtues become second nature. We now look at the intellectual traits or virtues that we exhibit when we apply the intellectual standards to each of the elements of thought. Let's begin with intellectual humility. Having a consciousness of the limits of one's knowledge, including a sensitivity to circumstances in which one's native egocentrism is likely to function self-deceptively, sensitivity to bias, prejudice, and limitations of one's viewpoint. Intellectual humility depends on recognizing that one should not claim more than one actually knows. It does not simply imply spinelessness or submissiveness. It does imply the lack of intellectual pretentiousness, boastfulness, or conceit, combined with insight into the logical foundations or lack of such foundations of one's belief. Confidence in reason. Confidence that in the long run one's own higher interests and those of humankind at large will be best served by giving the freest play to reason, by encouraging people to come to their own conclusions, by developing their own rational faculties. Faith that, with proper encouragement and cultivation, people can learn to think for themselves, to form rational viewpoints, draw reasonable conclusions, think coherently and logically, persuade each other by reason, and become reasonable persons, despite the deep-seated obstacles in the native character of the human mind and in society as we know it. Intellectual perseverance. Having a consciousness of the need to use intellectual insights and truths in spite of difficulties, obstacles, and frustrations. Firm adherence to rational principles despite the irrational opposition of others. A sense of the need to struggle with confusion and unsettled questions over an extended period of time to achieve deeper understanding or insight. Fair-mindedness. Having a consciousness of the need to treat all viewpoints alike, without reference to one's own feelings or vested interests, or the feelings or vested interests of one's friends, community, or nation. It implies adherence to intellectual standards without reference to one's own advantage or the advantage of one's group. Intellectual courage. Having a consciousness of the need to face and fairly address ideas, beliefs, or viewpoints toward which we have strong negative emotions and to which we have not given a serious hearing. This courage is connected with the recognition that ideas considered dangerous or absurd or sometimes rationally justified in whole or in part, and that conclusions and beliefs inculcated in us are sometimes false or misleading. To determine for ourselves which is which, we must not passively and uncritically accept what we have learned. Intellectual courage comes to play here, because inevitably we will come to see some truth in some ideas considered dangerous and absurd, and distortion or falsity in some ideas strongly held in our groups. We need courage to be true to our own thinking in such circumstances. The penalties for nonconformity can be severe. Intellectual empathy. Having a consciousness of the need to imaginatively put oneself in the place of others in order to genuinely understand them, which requires the consciousness of our egocentric tendency to identify truth with our immediate perceptions of long-standing thought or belief. This trait correlates with the ability to reconstruct accurately the viewpoints and reasoning of others, and to reason from premises, assumptions, and ideas other than our own. This trait also correlates with the willingness to remember occasions when we were wrong in the past, despite an intense conviction that we were right, and with the ability to imagine our being similarly deceived in a case at hand. Intellectual autonomy. Having rational control of one's beliefs, values, and inferences. The ideal of critical thinking is to learn to think for oneself, to gain command over one's thought processes. It entails a commitment to analyzing and evaluating beliefs on the basis of reason and evidence, to question when it is rational to question, to believe when it is rational to believe, and to conform when it is rational to conform. Intellectual integrity. Recognition of the need to be true to one's own thinking, to be consistent in the intellectual standards one applies, to hold oneself to the same rigorous standards of evidence and proof to which one holds one's antagonists, to practice what one advocates for others, and to honestly admit discrepancies and inconsistencies in one's own thought and action. We see here that the intellectual traits or the intellectual virtues are actually traits of the disciplined mind, in opposed to traits of the undisciplined mind, such as intellectual arrogance, unfairness, laziness, intellectual disregard for justice, intellectual distrust of reason, intellectual intellectual cowardice, intellectual self-centeredness, hypocrisy, and conformity. To wrap up this three-part series, the underlying principles of critical thinking are the intellectual standards that must be applied to the elements of thought as we develop intellectual traits. We want self-command of these principles of critical thinking, which we want kept alive in our minds and by continual engagement in everyday life. Critical thinkers use these theories to explain how the mind works. Then they apply those theories to the way they live. Critical thinking applies to every part of life. In final closing, consider the three workshops. Recall the complete big picture. Intellectual standards must be applied to the elements of thought as we learn to develop intellectual traits.